right, welcome everyone to our last history colloquium meeting of the fall term. My name is Jordan Howell and I'm professor in the Department of History. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Professor Alan Lester, who is a professor of historical geography at the University of Sussex and adjunct professor of history at La Trobe University. Before I tell you a bit more about Professor Lester's work, I'd like to note that today's event has been made possible by support from the Faculty of Arts, from the Department of History, and also from the Center for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Niniwak, and Sininewak, Dakota Oyate, and Dene, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. With these extremely important aims in mind, I'd like to call your attention to a recent piece, just published yesterday, I think, that Professor Alan Lester has written with Sean Carleton, Del Perry, and Omiyasu Wapasu for Active History. It is entitled Exposing Residential School Denialism's Transnational Network, and it considers how the project to distort the truth about residential schools in Canada has gone global. More broadly, Professor Lester has written widely on British colonial history. His books include Colonialism and the Origins of Humanitarian Governance, Protecting Aborigines Across the 19th Century British Empire, Imperial Networks, Creating Identities in 19th Century South Africa and Britain, and Deny and Disavow, Distancing the Imperial Past in the Culture Wars. Professor Lester is also the editor of several important collections, including most recently The Truth About Empire, Real Histories of British Colonialism. We want to note that he'll also be launching this work tomorrow night, Whodunit Books, at 6 p.m. With fellow contributors, Adele Perry and Sean Carleton. This collection is related to his recent work that challenges empire apologists and the twisting of imperial histories in the UK's culture wars. This is also the topic of his talk today, entitled, if it's still the same, The British Empire and the Culture War When Colonial History Becomes Politics. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Alan Lester.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for a very generous introduction, if anything a bit too generous. It was really Sean who wrote the thing that came out yesterday. my name just sort of happened to be added onto it. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for hosting me. And it's great to be here in such extreme temperatures as well. I'm just starting to get used to it, I think. So yeah, just a little bit about myself before I sort of get into it. I've been working for about sort of 30 years now on various aspects of British colonialism. I've been especially interested in the networks of communication through which ideas, discourses and practices of empire moved across the British Empire, whether they were networks of humanitarians, missionaries, anti-slavery activists, for example, or settler communities corresponding for newspapers, or governmental entities and governors who moved across empire. But recently, the last sort of 4 years or so, I guess was a sliding doors moment when both my personal circumstances and the world around me changed. I became quite ill and had to spend a lot of time in hospital and couldn't do the normal academic routines of teaching and research and administration. And at the same time, it coincided with the Black Lives Matter protests of June 2020 on either side of the Atlantic, and the backlash that immediately set in from certain right-wing interests against Black Lives Matter and against the more general reckoning with history that we had been seeing over the last decade or so. And so those two things together, me being sort of out of the normal academic routine and seeing how history was being misrepresented as part of this backlash, persuaded me that I would use the time that I had, partly in hospital and partly at home, to bring what knowledge I'd brought over the last 30 years to bear in these circumstances and see what little I could do to try and contest some of the misrepresentations. So that's really where this talk I'm about to give stems from. This is very much sort of UK-centric, but working with Sean and Adele, we've been encouraging one another to think much more globally about both the backlash against the reckoning with history in settler colonial places, in former British colonies elsewhere, and in my case particularly in the UK itself. So maybe we'll come on to talk a bit more about those connections later, but for now I'm going to talk about the UK context largely. Okay, so when I started out researching and teaching British colonialism in the early 1990s, really, the mainstream perception of the empire within Britain was very different to what it is now. I felt like I was in on a secret shared only with descendants of the enslaved and colonised, some anti-racist activists, some other historical specialists, and perhaps surprisingly Winston Churchill, who once admitted, quote, "Our claim to be left in the unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us." That's one of the Churchill quotes that you don't hear that often from his admirers. The secret was that conquering and maintaining the British Empire entailed tremendous and sustained violence. 65 wars of colonial aggression in the late 19th century alone, for example, with barely a year of that century passing free of conflict. And that colonial rule was underpinned by deeply entrenched ideologies of racism. Within academia, imperial history specialists were still preoccupied in the early 90s with how and why British men had come to govern up to a quarter of the Earth's surface, and were only just beginning to grapple with the challenge of post-colonial scholars, including scholars of colour, who are more interested in how colonialism was experienced by its subjects. In popular culture in the UK in the 90s, complacent racial stereotypes lingered, a hangover from the sitcoms that were shown on TV in my youth, like Love Thy Neighbour, Mind Your Language and It Ain't Half Hot Mum, all of which involve stereotyped people of colour. Comedians like Lenny Henry, Mira Sayal and Sanjeev Bhaskar, now household names in the UK, were described as second-generation immigrants and were just beginning to establish a self-owned black British TV presence. When the empire that had brought their parents to the UK was discussed explicitly in the popular media, a certain amount of violence and racial intolerance was acknowledged, only then to be brushed off as side effects of a project that had made Britain great and the world modern. Neil Ferguson's 2003 TV series and best-selling book, Empire, concluded that the British Empire existed to spread democracy, liberal institutions and free trade, before sacrificing itself to preserve the world from the Nazis. Over the last 2 decades, the challenges to any such complacent consensus on empire and its meaning for Britons have come thick and fast. Correspondingly, my field of specialism has become central to the polarising culture wars plaguing our politics. The change in colonial consciousness may seem sudden to many, but we can't understand it unless we trace its deep roots in the overlapping histories of the empire and of black people in Britain. So I'll talk briefly about the empire itself first, obviously far too vast to encompass succinctly. So the history of the empire is too sprawling and contradictory to encompass here, so let me concentrate only on the myth that prevailed among most Britons who stayed at home during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that was cemented most compellingly for my generation by Neil Ferguson's TV series and book. The late British Empire considered itself liberal, and it generated investments in governmental institutions and infrastructures that came to serve colonised peoples. It also fostered ideas of universalism and progress. But the myth refuses to concede that the freedoms and the rights accorded by colonialism were far from universal. The British Empire was the greatest vehicle the world had ever seen, not just for the dissemination of liberal ideas, but also for the entrenchment of racist ideologies that justified exclusions from their benefits. As they established political control, occupation and exploitation of most other parts of the world, the modern European empires, Britain's foremost among them, fostered a phenomenon that was quite novel in the broader history of empires, an entrenched association between status and racial difference. The association first developed with the transatlantic slave trade, since it was the first in which only black people were enslaved, and in which trafficked people became capital assets in a modern world economy used to leverage credit as well as supply commodities. While in the 17th century European travel literature had still tended to describe non-European peoples as nations, roughly equivalent to those of Europe, as the slave trade became the dominant form of interaction between Europe and Africa, so representations changed. By 1753, David Hume, the Enlightenment philosopher, suspected, and I quote, "the Negroes, and in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilised nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation." End quote. As First Nations in North America became less useful as military allies against the French and their land coveted more by settlers, so they too were slotted into an emerging racial hierarchy of the Enlightenment, above Africans but well below Europeans. In every European colony, settlers and their governments maintained racial hierarchies, and the celebrated British-led abolition of slavery did nothing to change the dominance of racial thinking. As Nancy Steppen put it, just as the battle against slavery was being won by abolitionists, the war against racism in European thought was being lost. By the late 19th century, most Britons felt that other races were potentially improvable, but over generations. The even more pessimistic beliefs of racial scientists like Robert Knox, that inferior races were biologically incapable of improvement, were the outcome of their search for an objective rationalisation of existing racial hierarchies. Hierarchical views of race were compatible with the notion that the Empire's job was to civilise people of colour, assisting them to catch up with the British or European race over an indefinable evolutionary timescale. In the meantime, the supposed primitiveness and exoticism of certain colonised people rationalised their exhibition in the human zoos, which toured Europe until the 1950s. By around 1900, for all the accommodations with princes in India, the princely states, and merchants, for all the recognition accorded to African chiefs under indirect rule, for all the reliance upon locally recruited or imported Indian troops and police in other colonies, notably in East Africa, and for all the espousal of universal liberal doctrines, those referred to as natives were expected to show deference to any white person they might encounter in every British colony. Periodically, moral panics would break out over rumours of black and brown men threatening white women's purity. Even the poorest white colonial families outside of the settler colonies generally had black and brown servants to do their domestic work. When those servants sought prosecutions for masters and mistresses who abused them, the odds of conviction were tiny in the face of white juries and judges, no matter how colourblind the law was in principle. Access not only to justice but to jobs, healthcare, education, democracy and even the railways was generally conditioned by race as well as by wealth. Most British colonial authorities used property qualifications or territorial distinctions in rights and privileges, or simply trusted to the informal policing of local officials to create a de facto regime of white supremacy without specifically mentioning race de jure. This allowed for much of the everyday racism of colonial rule to be hidden from the view of metropolitan Britons. Many of the national servicemen sent from Britain to fight in the late colonial wars of the 1950s and 60s expressed their shock that local colonial authorities and settlers discriminated so routinely, blatantly and brutally against black and brown subject peoples. Many Britons in the 20th century believed sincerely in a liberal empire, but what they saw as being appropriate for Britons at home and in the settler colonies was not necessarily seen as suitable for the subject races. Colonial subjects of colour needed to be civilised, it was thought, before they could exercise the responsibilities that came along with liberalism's individual rights. Black and brown people were seen by the Britons who governed them as being like children, whose demands for equal rights with adults would be accommodated only for the sake of expediency. In the 1870s, the Secretary of State for India, Lord Salisbury, conceded that, quote, if England was to remain supreme, she must tolerate the political role of Indian princes and of participation by Indians in the administration. He added later, however, that if the number of well-educated Indians should increase, the government would face the indecent and embarrassing necessity of closing that avenue to them. The Colonial Secretary, Henry III Earl Grey, put it more bluntly. The principal bar to self-government in most colonies, he wrote, was their being inhabited chiefly by a population of which a large proportion is not of European race. British governance nonetheless gained widespread acceptance in many black and Asian communities. It facilitated long-term prosperity for Indian merchants, investors and middle classes, and hundreds of thousands of colonised people sought alliances and worked on behalf of colonial authorities. The British colonies in East Africa were governed with the assistance of the Indians who migrated there as soldiers, policemen, civil servants, labourers and traders, forming a middle strata between colonised Africans and their British rulers. With much to lose if their status was reduced to that of Africans, these Indian subjects often expressed virulent anti-African racism. Millions of colonial subjects served in the British military, and their deployment was critical in the success of most colonial campaigns, whether their motives were secure employment and remittances, personal status and pride in a martial identity, comradeship, the avoidance of slavery in the case of the British West India regiments, famine or other forms of work, or loyalty to the empire. Although Britain, as an advanced industrial power with emerging traditions of effective and liberal governance, had much to offer its colonies, the intrinsic nature of colonial rule mitigated against all but a grudging sharing of these benefits. Sharing the rights that Britons had at home, especially those of democratic governance, with colonised black and brown subjects overseas would have meant the loss of Britain's colonial advantage. As those colonial national servicemen found when they arrived in Kenya, Malaya, Aden and Cyprus, it was not generally contemplated until there really was no other choice. Turning from the empire then, that sort of potted survey of the late empire, to the presence of black former subjects of empire in Britain. This history of the colonies became far more intimately connected with the history of Britain during this same period of late empire, when both Conservative and Labour governments were still trying to hang on to the empire. The distance between Britain and its colonies closed considerably as greater numbers of black and brown subjects migrated to the imperial motherland. Despite successive governments' attempts to resolve post-war labour shortages by attracting white migrants while deterring black and Asian ones, they came in their hundreds of thousands, and they came knowing that most Britons still saw them as racially problematic. A point brought home by the widespread support that Conservative MP Enoch Powell received despite his sacking after his 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, in which he predicted unrest if more black immigrants were allowed to settle in Britain. The first generation of so-called Windrush migrants, named after a ship which brought hundreds of them from the West Indies from the Caribbean in 1948, responded with campaigns like the Bristol bus boycotts of 1963, in which black people boycotted a bus company that only allowed black drivers on certain unpopular routes. That prompted the banning of outright racial discrimination in the UK's first Race Relations Act. The Act did little to erase the prevalence of racism in everyday life, though. The acquittal of the Mangrove Nine, a group of anti-racist activists who met in a cafe in Brixton and were continually harassed by the police in 1970, first highlighted systematic racial discrimination within the Metropolitan Police, that's the London Police, 30 years before Macpherson's report into the racist murder of black teenager Stephen Lawrence. The Scarman report into the riots, or what many black people refer to as the uprisings of 1981, in London, Liverpool, Birmingham and Leeds, sparked by heavy-handed policing of black youths, affirmed that representatives of the state were still discriminating against black people, whatever the law might say, just as colonial governments had done to the participants in those riots' parents. By the early 2000s, it was clear to many black people in both the UK and the USA that the achievement of equal civil rights in law was not enough to end systematic racial discrimination. The Black Lives Matter movement began in the USA in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who had shot dead the unarmed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. But its appeal was felt across what Paul Gilroy has called the Black Atlantic, the connective tissue between descendants of the Atlantic slavery system on 3 continents. When the protests following the murder of George Floyd spread to the UK in June 2020, there was a terrible symmetry with the riots of the early 1980s. As David Olusoga explains, both sets of events took place in the cities from which the slave traders had set sail in the 17th and 18th centuries, Liverpool, Bristol and London. Cities that had been enriched by the slave trade and the sugar business saw fires set and barricades erected by young people who were the distant descendants of human cargo. Not far from the flickering flames of the 1981 Bristol riots, a statue of Edward Colston, a slave trader and a member of the Royal African Company in the 17th century, looked on as the police were driven out of the Black St Paul's district. When Colston's statue was toppled in the Black Lives Matter protests of June 2020, it was not simply a knee-jerk response to what African Americans were doing. It was the culmination of frustration that black lives still did not seem to matter as much as white lives in Britain as in the USA. The protest broke out in the middle of the COVID pandemic, which in itself brought a spotlight to bear on the UK's enduring racial inequities. Due to the overrepresentation of black people in low-paid public-facing service roles, along with housing and health inequalities, the mortality rate from the virus was running at 256 per 100,000 black men and only 87 per 100,000 white men in June 2020. Black women were dying at the rate of 120 per 100,000, with white women at 52 per 100,000. In 2016, black graduates were paid 23% less than their white counterparts, and since 2010, there had been a 49% increase in the number of unemployed ethnic minority, 16 to 24-year-olds, while the figure for their white counterparts had fallen by 2%. Black people were twice as likely to be murdered, and when accused of crimes, 3 times more likely to be prosecuted and sentenced than white people. In 2022, black households were the most likely of all ethnic groups to have a weekly income of less than £400, and people in white British households were consistently the least likely to live in low-income households. The Windrush scandal was also a part of the British social fabric that gave rise to the 2020 protests. So the Windrush scandal, for those of you who don't know, involved mainly children who came over with their parents as part of that first Windrush generation, invited to Britain to take up roles in mostly public sector jobs. Those children were officially permitted into the country and allowed to reside in Britain, but were never given official papers stating their residence status. And under a hostile environment policy, as it was called, towards migrants recently, the Conservative government rounded up a number of these children, some of whom had been living in Britain for half a century, and deported some of them to places that they'd never seen in their lives, back to the Caribbean. Many of them lost their jobs, lost their homes, and so on as a result. As the official report into the 2018 scandal explained, it was allowed to happen in part because of the public's and officials' poor understanding of Britain's colonial history, the history of inward and outward migration, and the history of black Britons. So the dumping of Edward Colston, this slave trader's statue in Bristol Harbour, the crystallising moment of Black Lives Matter in Britain, reflected this history, with which most white Britons are still quite unfamiliar. As David Olusoga explains, quote, "Those wrongly caught in the dragnet of the hostile environment were the children of men and women who had been encouraged to migrate to post-war Britain. These people, with their centuries-long links to Britain and British history, were suddenly classified as illegal immigrants in the country they'd called home for decades." The Colston statue, like hundreds of others scattered across Britain, was an active part of the great amnesia and obfuscation that has long functioned to airbrush the realities of slavery and the slave trade out of mainstream British history. End quote. The protests of 2020 were about entrenched racism inherited from colonialism and the historical amnesia that refused to recognise it. These were not grievances about the past, but about the present. The history that prompted Black Lives Matter is not one that's done, not one that we can all just now move on from. Anti-racist activists are protesting the ongoing imprint of colonial ideas and practices in Britain. We can turn to Olusoga again for a helpful articulation. He writes, "The generation that found its voice and expressed its demands in the summer of 2020 not only had access to a once hidden history, they came to it with attitudes radically different from those of their parents' and grandparents' generations. Rather than being eager to conceal and whitewash over the inglorious and murderous chapters in the long history of Britain's relationship with Africans and Africa, they were determined to confront them. The historical amnesia that's enabled the veneration of slave traders and empire builders is to them a clear and obvious outrage. This determination to acknowledge and confront Black British history and draw it into the mainstream is new and may well shape our relationship with our national history in the coming decades. Which brings me to the reaction to those demands for a reshaping of our relationship with history, for a reckoning with the past. Fundamentally, the culture war over colonial history that's broken out over the last 5 years in the UK is the result of a backlash against any such reshaping of our relationship with the past. Even though history is its language of mobilisation, this culture war is about politics. It's motivated by the need to hold contemporary anti-racist demands at bay by holding historical awareness at bay. This is why participants like Kemi Badenoch, who has recently become the leader of the Conservative Party in opposition after we had a general election and the Labour Party were elected, why participants like Kemi Badenoch complain about, quote, the people who are trying to change what's written in our history books, what's in our museums, end quote. If only, she thinks, we could all continue to see the empire as metropolitan liberals used to see it, as a force for good overall, then there would be no need to address the racism to which it gave birth. Played out in Parliament, the press and on TV, the culture war over British colonial history is a battle for the soul of the nation and for the definition of 21st century Britishness. It's no coincidence that those prosecuting it most vigorously tend to be those who are also most vehemently opposed to the immigration of black and brown people and to multiculturalism, describing that as a failed project. So we've got a list here of a number of flashpoints in the UK culture. I won't go into all of them in great depth. I'll skim across a few of them, but we can come back to some later if we want to discuss them further. I want to talk about Rhodes Must Fall, though, as one of the first salvos in the war for the soul of Britain, because it predated the Black Lives Matter protests by about 4 years. So in 2016, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign travelled across the metaphorical Black Atlantic from South Africa, where students at the University of Cape Town successfully removed this brooding figure of Cecil Rhodes, shown on the left here, that loomed over the UCT campus. When students at Oxford began a successor campaign to remove the much smaller statue of Cecil Rhodes above the entrance to Oriel College, Oxford, that's the one shown on the right, an Oxford professor, Nigel Biggar, a conservative nationalist theologian at Oriel College, was one of the first public figures to turn his attention to the colonial past. He established a research program funded by an American evangelical foundation, the MacDonald Foundation, to defend the ethics of colonialism. And looking back on this sort of recent history of culture war, this has loomed larger in my mind as a key turning point. Was what Biggar did. He had a choice before him. He could either accept historians and black South African students' explanations of what Rhodes did, which was effectively to reconfigure black Southern African society in the image of his diamond mines, his railway, his conquests of what became Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia. So he could accept that Rhodes was a tremendously destructive force in black Southern African society. But then as a discrete matter, discuss what should be done about the statue. Accepting that history didn't necessarily mean that the statue should be removed. You could have a debate about that. But where Biggar, I think, proved tremendously influential, and the sort of ripples of this have reverberated since, was that he chose another tactic. He chose instead historical revisionism. He chose to ignore Rhodes's role in history and to rehabilitate Rhodes's reputation. So he went back to try and find out what justifications he could produce for Rhodes's actions. Many of them, of course, drawn from Rhodes himself and his own self-justifications and those of his contemporaries. So this marked a real turning point, I think. Rather than just discussing the memorialisation of the past, it became a discussion of a revisionist past. With allies in the right-wing press, especially the UK's main right-wing newspapers, the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, Biggar began to argue that to question Britain's historical record on empire was to undermine the foundations upon which Western hegemony as a whole relied. This was another key argument of his that has since filtered out into a broader culture war. That argument was soon being aired not just in Britain, but across its former settler colonies, including among Trump-supporting Republicans in the US and the new populist right more generally. The National Conservative Conference, described by Sky News as a global right-wing movement which claims that traditional values are being undermined and overthrown, and promotes national conservatism as the best path forward for a democratic world confronted by a rising China abroad and a powerful new Marxism at home, end quote, is a key vehicle for the dissemination of Bigger's intellectual rationales. In 2017, the academic journal Third World Quarterly published an article by Canadian-American Bruce Gilley, not only defending Britain and Europe's colonial record, but calling for voluntary recolonisation. He presented data which appeared to show that formerly colonised countries had fared better on a range of indices in the long run than those which had remained independent, blaming stalled progress on the nationalists who led many countries to independence. Academics criticised Gilley's methods, data and findings, and the article sparked a furious reaction from anti-racist activists who saw it as eliding the violence and the racism of colonialism. The publisher, as many of you will know, withdrew the article on the grounds that serious threats had been made against the journal's editor. This was a flashpoint in the culture war because it gave the right ammunition. That suppression and withdrawal of Gilley's paper has been invoked ever since as a sign of woke cancel culture. So Bigger is able to position his book as bravely speaking out against the threat of cancellation, and to say that the first publisher for his book withdrew on the grounds of fear at such a woke reaction of the kind that Gilley had had. In immediate aftermath of the June 2020 protests and Colson's toppling, discussion of the colonial past reached new levels of intensity. A crowd-funded website set up initially to protest at a visit to the UK by Donald Trump hosted a Topple the Racist map, identifying other statues of men involved in colonial violence and exploitation, ripe for targeting by anti-racist protesters. Activists called for some of them to be removed or for additional explanatory plaques to be added. Right-wing newspapers and some conservative politicians reacted by encouraging groups of far-right activists to form protection rings around statues, including many that nobody was proposing to remove. There's a nice bit in the foreword to the Truth About Empire by Satnam Sanghera about a load of people draping themselves in the Union Jack, the British flag, surrounding the statue of George Eliot, the writer, whom nobody was threatening. She was actually associated more with anti-slavery than with slavery, so she would have been a hero. And he writes that perhaps they thought she was being threatened by armies of Jane Austen fans. Oliver Dowden, who was then the Secretary of State for Culture, declared, quote, "I would happily chain myself to Nelson to stop him being removed." And for those of you who've been to London and Trafalgar Square might know Nelson stands at the top of a 52-metre high column. And I'd like to have seen him climb that to chain himself to him. Aside from the contestation over statues, the Black Lives Matter movement prompted a number of venerable institutions, including Oxbridge colleges, the Church of England, the Royal Family, banks, insurance companies and large corporations to trace their own complicity in slavery in particular and plan reparative actions, with a corresponding condemnation of such efforts as woke from those opposed. Recently, right-wing salvos have been fired at the Church of England's report on reparations for its role in the trafficking and ownership of enslaved people on mission-owned plantations in Barbados. In 2021, the Black Lives Matter protesters graffitied the word racist on the plinth of Winston Churchill's statue in Westminster. The Cambridge College, named as his national memorial, Churchill College, Cambridge, embarked upon a series of online discussions to bring to light his relationship with race and empire. Even before the first event had taken place, the Daily Mail quoted Churchill's grandson, Sir Nicholas Soames, who's a Conservative Member of Parliament, who described it as an idiotic debate that's got out of control in all our universities. In 2020, the Mail had already been forced to pay the academic who had chaired the discussions, Professor Priyamvada Gopal, £25,000 in damages after claiming falsely that she was, quote, attempting to incite a race war and that she supported and endorsed the subjugation and persecution of white people. The Churchill College series of debates lasted for just 2 sessions before it was terminated by a campaign orchestrated by the right-wing think tank Policy Exchange, the Telegraph newspaper and the Churchill family, who threatened to withdraw support for the college's hosting of the Churchill Archive and brought the discussions to an end while complaining about woke cancel culture. A Policy Exchange paper published by Andrew Roberts and Zuditu Gebriohannes, misrepresenting what a panel comprised of scholars of colour had said about Churchill, was critical to their victory. At the same time, one of Churchill's greatest admirers, Boris Johnson, promised the appointment of a commission to report definitively on issues of racial inequality. It proved to be enormously controversial since its conclusions were predetermined by Johnson, announcing that it would find this is a country that's made huge progress in tackling racism. The Brixton-raised black educator Tony Sewell, now Lord Sewell, was appointed chair, and other commissioners of colour with notable achievements were recruited, essentially to blame certain black people themselves for their experiences of marginalisation and exclusion. Those of Caribbean descent, especially, had apparently failed to appreciate that, to quote the report, the system is no longer deliberately rigged against them. As anticipated, Sewell was able to reassure Boris Johnson and the government that, quote, it is counterproductive and divisive to suggest that white people's attitudes and behaviours primarily cause the disadvantage experienced by ethnic minorities. Within a few days, it became clear that the report's methodology was suspect, to say the least. Many of the academic experts it claimed to have consulted refuted the use to which their testimony was put. The Runnymede Trust, a body which monitors racism in Britain, noted the cherry-picking of data on school attainment thresholds to indicate that white pupils rather than black are disadvantaged. This, the Trust said, was part of a consistent pattern of, quote, rhetoric which pits the white working class against ethnic minorities. And the report failed to notice that white working class boys still have substantially higher rates of employment and social mobility than black boys, even if they graduate with lesser qualifications. The biggest problem was that the report's methodology excluded even the possibility of racism being at play in British society. The commissioners decided in advance that any racial disparities in the data they considered would either be explained on the grounds of factors other than race, which included geography, as if where people live has nothing whatsoever to do with race, class, or sex. If it couldn't be explained as one of these non-racial factors, then the disparity was simply left as unexplained. To the considerable anger of many within black British communities, the Sewell report seemed more intent on reassuring white Britons that they need not take the trouble to understand black Britain's experiences of racism than on identifying what racism there still is within the UK. As the Sewell report was being aired, over 50 Conservative MPs formed the informal Common Sense Group, a parliamentary lobby group. Their manifesto was published called Common Sense, Conservative Thinking for a Post-Liberal Age. And it was written in very explicit reaction to Black Lives Matter. Introduced by the group's chair, Sir John Hayes, it decries, quote, the intolerant woke dogma of Black Lives Matter, seeing it as an extreme cultural and political group fueled by ignorance and an arrogant determination to erase the past and dictate the future. Gareth Bacon, MP, claimed that, quote, traducing the reputation of key figures in our country's history calls the very sense of what it is to be British into question. Britain is under attack, he continued, not in a physical sense, but in a philosophical, ideological and historical sense. One of the Common Sense Group's first targets was the white professor, Corinne Fowler, who had co-authored a report for the National Trust. This is Britain's main heritage and conservation organisation. Maintains about 500 stately homes, country houses, these sort of quintessentially British properties with their landscape gardens. Conventionally a very small C conservative organisation. It's the kind of place where middle class families would go on their weekends. So Corinne had authored a report for them in 2019 using existing peer-reviewed research to identify properties connections with colonial activities of various kinds, so which houses have been funded by slave owners, for example, so that curators of the houses could choose to present more complete histories to visitors if they wanted. The report went relatively unmarked until November 2020, after the Black Lives Matter protests, when Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg condemned the report in Parliament, and members of the Common Sense group signed a letter to the Telegraph accusing the National Trust of, quote, being coloured by a cultural Marxist dogma, colloquially known as the woke agenda. The Telegraph obligingly prepared the ground for referring the National Trust to the Charity Commission on the grounds that the report was outside its charitable remit, a claim that the Commission then had to investigate but found to be without substance. Colin Fowler's subsequent work continued, however, to be the target of the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail and Common Sense Group MPs in Parliament. When the Mail claimed, again quite falsely, that she had likened Japanese treatment of prisoners of war to British colonialism, Fowler received an avalanche of hate mail and threats. She was telling me recently that some of these far-right ethno-nationalists even got hold of her children's telephone numbers and were phoning her children to make threats against their mother as a result of the story carried in the Daily Mail. Restore Trust, now a private limited company, was founded with Jacob Rees-Mogg's support to continue its campaign against the National Trust for being more open about the colonial history. Restore Trust has now tried 4 times to get its candidates elected to the National Trust Council, aiming to reverse its openness about the past and its moves towards greater inclusivity in the present. Restore Trust not only opposes the National Trust revealing more information about colonial histories, it has also attacked the National Trust for engaging with gay pride events and for rewilding projects. One of its more recent attacks, again aired in the Mail and Telegraph, was, believe it or not, on the scones supplied in National Trust cafes. Despite the Daily Mail having praised them when the new recipe was first adopted about 10 years ago, they were now condemned as woke because they use vegan-friendly margarine instead of butter. In August 2021, a group of scholars, including Robert Toombs, Neil Ferguson, Andrew Roberts and Nigel Biggar, banded together to create the History Reclaimed project. It too has since registered as a private company and has become transnational with Canadian members. According to the Daily Mail, the group was established to battle Black Lives Matter's quote, woke war on our great leaders. Zudita Gabriel-Hannis, the co-author of the report that had misrepresented the Churchill College panel, worked at Policy Exchange, is a former director of Restore Trust and is deputy editor at History Reclaimed. It shows how interconnected these right-wing networks, culture war networks, are. She was appointed by the last government as a trustee of the Victoria and Albert Museum in order to put the brakes on its supposed wokeness too. And she's now a senior researcher at the Legatum Institute, which is directed by the former special advisor to Jacob Rees-Mogg, and which also supports the National Conservative conferences, and like many other of these organisations, is funded in very obscure ways, we think, by right-wing millionaires. History Reclaimed members Robert Toombs and David Abulafia have supplied a steady stream of articles to the Telegraph over the last few years, with titles such as "The Rewriting of History Has Taken a Sinister Turn," "The Anti-Racist Mission to Destroy Britain is Working and We Have Surrendered," "Colonialism is More Complex Than Woke Historians Would Have You Believe," "Time for Historians to Fight Back Against the Ideologues Who Want to Tear Down the Past," and "Woke Activists Take Note, There's No Public Appetite for Erasing British History." Last year also saw the publication of History Reclaimed founder Nigel Biggar's book Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, the first serious attempt since Bruce Gillies to lend intellectual credibility to the justification of colonialism. It was listed at number 10 in the Sunday Times non-fiction sales list and topped a number of Amazon's subcategories. It purports to be a balanced, rigorously researched account of colonial practices and an analysis of their ethics. It received glowing reviews in the Sunday Times, the Telegraph and the Spectator, and Amazon purchasers have titled their reviews "Imperious, brilliant historical research, and particularly galling, at last a competent book on the subject of empire. Bigger alleged that an unthinking anti-colonialism, quote, is fashionable in academia, opening doors to posts, promotions and grants. He argues that scholars of colonialism have been brainwashed by Frantz Fanon's preference for, quote, barbarous vitality and irresponsibility over civilised reason and restraint. And he even speculates, remember he's a theologian, that, quote, a degenerate Christian sensibility has resulted in a perverse bid for supreme self-righteousness, and it's this which drives critiques of colonialism. I reviewed the book for the Academic Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, concluding that it had cherry-picked its evidence, ignored most of the relevant scholarship on empire, and was tendentious throughout. Bigger was given a right to reply in the journal and responded that, despite my having researched and written on the British Empire for decades before the Culture War, I was driven by the same woke ideology that had overtaken and corrupted Western academia at large, and I was now rendering the West vulnerable to the authoritarian threats of Russia and China. I was, according to Bigger, effectively Vladimir Putin's agent. In my view, the National Conservatives, like Professor Bigger, the right-wing think tanks like Policy Exchange, the Mail and the Telegraph, are waging this culture war not because they have any interest in history, but because they want to preserve certain aspects of history. They're fighting to maintain a particular kind of Britishness that was compatible with a particular view of empire, and to maintain a Western supremacy that they associate with whiteness, explicitly or not. This is the kind of Britishness that most white people within Britain took for granted in the first half of the 20th century, before the mass immigration of black and brown people from the former colonies, and when empire could still be fondly imagined as largely benevolent within Britain. It's the kind of Britishness that dominated before most Britons faced demands to recognise and act upon their racism. The culture war over colonial history is one in which one side is asking us to consider inheritances of the colonial past that continue to shape black Britons and other subjects of colour's lives, and the other is using every means available, and they are relatively powerful means, to dissuade us from listening. It's a struggle over history and geography, but most fundamentally it's a struggle over race. Of those Telegraph headlines, perhaps the most telling is this one: the anti-racist mission to destroy Britain is working, and we've surrendered. What does it say about the Britishness we want if it can be preserved only by refusing to surrender to anti-racism? This is about more than just Britishness now, though. It's about those who feel that the best way of clinging on to Western hegemony at a time of tectonic geopolitical shifts is to defend the West's history of colonialism. Those on the far right argue that hegemony is still explained in the racial terms used by one of Britain's most famous colonial administrators, Frederick Lugard. In 1922, he warned against any threat to, quote, the prestige by which alone the white races can hope to govern and guide. A century later, there are many on both sides of the Atlantic still trying to heed his racist message. I'll leave it there, thanks.